Okinawa, late spring of night. The air still tastes of gunpowder. Smoke curls from shattered trees. Drifting across a cratered ridge where a handful of American soldiers move cautiously through silence thick enough to choke on. Their boots crunch over burnt coral and glass. Somewhere ahead, a faint whimper woman's voice, hushed, trembling. When they find the source, even the lieutenant stops breathing. Inside a half-collapsed tunnel lie 7 Japanese women, once nurses of the Imperial Army, their white uniforms now streaked with soot and blood. One of them holds a medical satchel, the red cross faintly visible through grime. They surrender without a sound. The lieutenant, Milton Reeves, is 26 and furious. He lost nearly half his platoon the night before. To him, every Japanese uniform, male or female, is an echo of that loss. Paint your faces with ash, he snaps, pointing to the smoldering jeep beside the tunnel. The women stare, confused. Do it, he barks again. When one hesitates, a sergeant raises his rifle. Slowly, hands trembling, they obey, rubbing ash over cheeks, foreheads, eyelids, transforming themselves into gray statues beneath the Okinawan sun. Around them, the American patrol stands still. A medic, Corporal Dean Harris, writes in his logbook. They looked like ghosts. It isn't part of any manual or procedure, this order. It's just anger with a uniform. Reeves's men exchange uneasy glances, but no one intervenes. The women, eyes downcast, smear the last traces of ash and wait for what comes next. For a long minute, there is nothing, only the soft hiss of wind through burning trees. Then Reeves mutters, "Take them to the trucks." As they march, Harris notices one woman stumble and reach instinctively to steady another. There's no pleading, no protest, only a silent dignity that unsettles him more than any scream could. He knows this moment will not appear in official reports. It doesn't fit the war's narrative of heroes and enemies. By evening, the captives sit in the corner of a makeshift compound, their faces still gray. The American guards don't speak to them. The ash begins to dry and flake, falling like dark snow onto the ground. And somewhere in that silence, the shame of one man's order begins to echo wider through whispers, through rumors, through every campfire that night. Because by morning, paint your face with ash had become a rule no one could explain, but everyone feared to question. Morning drips in slow, gray light over the makeshift POW compound. The 7 women sit in a line beside a torn canvas tent, their faces still streaked with yesterday's ash. When the guards bring water, none of them move at first. The ash has hardened overnight, cracking like old paint. A gust of wind scatters flakes across the dirt, ghostly reminders of what they were forced to wear. One American private whispers, "They look like statues." Another replies, "They were told not to wash it off." The order born from rage has already turned into ritual. Reeves doesn't appear that morning. He's somewhere at headquarters, writing his version of events. But the memory of his command lingers. The guards exchange glances every time they pass the women, unsure if they should offer food or simply look away. The women, mostly nurses from Okinawa's field hospitals, speak little. Their leader, a 30-year-old named Fumiko, quietly organizes them, folding blankets, tending to small wounds with the last scraps of gauze. They don't weep. They don't resist. They exist in silence so heavy, it unnerves even the battle-hardened men watching them. When Corporal Dean Harris walks by, he stops. The sight is unbearable. Soot-blackened faces, eyes hollow but alive. He scribbles in his journal, "They didn't cry. They turned to stone." He can't shake the feeling that this silence is louder than any explosion he survived, that it says something about the war that no report ever will. By midday, the ash begins to streak down as sweat mixes with soot. One of the women, her hand trembling, wipes a tear and leaves a clean mark down her cheek. For a moment, the others see it, a glimpse of the human beneath the humiliation, but no one speaks. Not yet. That evening, when rations are handed out, one of the younger soldiers murmurs, "Sir, They need to wash. The sergeant shrugs. Orders are orders. The line passes food, eyes averted. The women eat in silence, facing the ground. A crow circles overhead, its cry slicing the still air. And then, as the sun dips behind the hills, Harris pulls out his notebook again. He writes one line that won't be read for decades. If shame had a sound, it would be silence. He doesn't know it yet, but that silence is about to find its voice through his own pen. Corporal. Dean Harris never meant to become a historian. He was a medic 3 years old, exhausted, and carrying more ghosts in his notebook than names. The night after the ash order, he sits on an overturned ammo crate, flashlight trembling in his hand. The pages of his medical log are supposed to hold blood pressure readings and morphine counts, not memories. Yet he begins to write what he saw that morning. They looked like ghosts, not enemies, not soldiers, just ghosts made of smoke and shame. The Okinawa wind flips the page, as if the island itself wants the story written. Around him, other soldiers laugh at some crude joke, trying to erase the day. Harris can't. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees the women's gray faces, the cracks forming as the sun baked the ash dry. He remembers one woman pressing her fingers to another's wrist, checking a pulse with the calm of a trained nurse. Humanity surviving humiliation. There were only a handful of Americans who kept unauthorized war diaries in the Pacific. Most were confiscated or destroyed before men shipped home. But Harris doesn't stop. He writes through the night, descriptions of the tunnel, the smell of burnt oil, Reeves's shaking voice, and the silence that followed. He never names the lieutenant, but anyone reading would feel the man's rage seeping between the lines. The next morning, Harris adds one more sentence. I don't know which side I serve, any more medicine or orders. That confession will never make it into any official record. When he tears the page from his notebook and hides it in a tin medical box, he's not thinking about history. He's thinking about distance, how far he can place this memory from the rest of his life. By the end of the week, the camp moves inland. The women are transferred with other captives, faces still faintly gray despite the rain. Harris's notebook travels in his pack, buried under bandages and iodine bottles. Every night he adds a few more lines, details that the military reports will never mention. He doesn't know it yet, but those words, 47 entries, in all will outlive him. Decades later, in a dusty Kansas attic, that same notebook will resurface, and the world will finally read what he saw. Kansas, 1983. A small-town estate auction draws a few curious neighbors and one young historian, Mark Danner, hunting for forgotten relics of the Pacific War. The air smells of dust and old varnish. Inside a wooden box labeled Personal Effects, Harris, D. He finds a tin medical container sealed with rust. When he pries it open, there's a brittle notebook, its edges stained gray, like it once slept near smoke. The first page reads, Okinawa, May 1945. The handwriting is cramped, hurried, as if someone wrote between explosions. 47 entries total. 12 from Okinawa. 3 centered on something called the Ash Order. Danner's pulse quickens. He flips through the pages, and the words come alive. Paint your faces with ash. They obeyed in silence. Shame made visible. He looks closer. Ashes have literally smudged the ink in places. The physical evidence of that moment clings to the paper nearly 40 years later. That night, Danner can't sleep. He sits under a desk lamp, reading until dawn. Every paragraph feels like a camera flash from the past, unfiltered, unapproved, unpatriotic. There are no grand speeches, no heroes, just a medic, haunted by what he witnessed. He notes the details, the women's trembling hands, the gray flakes falling like snow, the officers who looked away. Harris's words are stripped of vengeance, written in the flat tone of a man trying not to feel. That makes them even heavier. By morning, Danner realizes he's holding something historians rarely find, an unedited moral record. In the margin of one page, Harris wrote, "History will forget their names, but not their faces." Danner stares at that line for a long time. It's not poetry, it's guilt turned into ink. He writes to a veterans archive, offering to donate the notebook. Weeks later, they reply, "No record of Corporal Dean Harris found, no service number, no unit file, nothing." A man who documented history seems erased from it. Danner feels a chill. Maybe Harris wanted it that way. Maybe his silence after the war was the final entry. But as the historian reads those smudged words again, one image grows sharper: the camp itself. Its contradictions, its rules, its quiet cruelties. And that's where Harris's story leads next. The place where ash became order. The camp sat on the southern edge of Okinawa's ruined hills, a sprawl of tents stitched together with desperation and wire. Officially, it was called Temporary Detention Site 19. Unofficially, soldiers called it Camp Halfway, half mercy, half punishment. The American flag fluttered limply above the guard post, its colors faded by smoke. Inside, order was routine, but humanity was rationed. The women from the tunnel were placed in the southeast corner, separated from male prisoners by a canvas barrier that smelled of mildew and gun oil. Harris's diary described it all, the clash of opposites. The camp doctor offered soup 1 hour, then turned away when an officer barked insults the next. Red Cross inspectors, when they came, nodded, took notes, and left quickly. Their reports later claimed generally humane conditions, though even the language sounded uncertain. In truth, only 40% of Pacific POW camps ever met Red Cross standards. This one barely scraped by. Every morning the women lined up for inspection. They were told to keep the ash until further orders. Some obeyed quietly. Others rubbed it off and were forced to reapply it. The Americans didn't understand the ritual that was forming in silence. For the prisoners, the ash had become armor, a shield against humiliation. But for the guards, it was something else. A reminder that even victory could feel shameful. Harris often watched from the infirmary tent. He noted in his diary, they were treated better than by their own officers, but still less than human. It was the paradox of the camp: medicine beside cruelty, mercy beside pride. The Japanese nurses helped treat wounded Americans, bandaging the same kind of bullet wounds their countrymen had inflicted days before. One guard joked nervously, "Guess we're all just patching ghosts." No one laughed. At night, the sound of coughing mixed with the rhythmic slap of waves on the nearby shore. The war was still raging just miles away, yet here, in this fenced pocket, something quieter was happening: a struggle, not for land, but for dignity. And behind that struggle stood one man's anger, because the ash order wasn't from command. It came from Lieutenant Milton Reeves, whose pride and grief had just begun to spiral. Lieutenant Milton Reeves was the kind of officer the war made and then broke. 26 years old, Kansas-born, clean jawline, turned hard by sleepless nights. His men called him Iron Teeth, not for bravery, but because he ground his jaw until blood showed on his gums. 2 days before the ash order, Reeves had watched 31 of his soldiers die in a hillside ambush. The screams, the smoke, the futility, all of it boiled into something that looked like command but felt like collapse. When they captured the women, Reeves saw no civilians. He saw the flag stitched on their torn armbands, the red circle he now equated with death. He wanted control, even if that control came through cruelty. The order to paint your faces with ash wasn't written, wasn't approved, and wasn't questioned because everyone around him was too numb to resist. War has a way of shrinking conscience, Harris wrote later. He pointed to the burned jeep. "Use that," he said. "Make them wear their defeat." The phrase cut deeper than the command itself. It wasn't about discipline, it was about spectacle. Reeves wanted the world, or at least his squad, to see humiliation turned into justice. But what he didn't expect was the unease that followed. As the days passed, some of his men began to avoid his eyes. Private Connors muttered, "This ain't right." Another refused to escort the women for work detail. Reeves responded with cold precision. Demotions, silent punishments, extra patrols. The lieutenant's authority held, but barely, Harris noted. His eyes looked like the sky before a storm gray, waiting to break. There were rumors that Reeves had written home about being let down by command, that his anger wasn't only at the enemy but at superiors who'd sent him into impossible odds. In that sense, the Ash Order wasn't born in hate. Alone it was also grief, warped into control. But grief never stays hidden long. By the end of the week, the other soldiers had stopped mentioning his name. They just called him the Ghostmaker. And when a new batch of supplies arrived, camera, rations, and a war correspondent, Reeves saw a chance to justify himself. He wanted proof that his order had meaning, and that proof would come through a single photograph, one frame that would outlive them all. The day the photographer arrived, the camp's mood shifted. Soldiers straightened their uniforms. Prisoners froze mid. Lieutenant Reeves paced like a man auditioning for history. He wanted that single image to tell his version of the story. American order, Japanese surrender. But war doesn't follow scripts. Private Thomas Connors, 19 years old and already older than his age, was hauling water near the women's enclosure when he heard Reeves shout, "Line them up." The order cracked across the camp like a whip. Connors stopped. He'd seen enough in the last week to know something inside him had changed. He muttered under his breath, "Sir, they're civilians." Reeves's head snapped around. They wore the flag. Same thing. Harris, standing nearby, caught Connors' eye. Both men shared the same expression, a quiet disgust. Neither dared voice. The photographer raised his camera. The women obeyed, faces gray with old ash and new sweat. The shutter clicked. Once, twice. Silence. In his diary, Harris later wrote, "When the flash went off, I saw one of them flinch not from fear, but defiance." The act of obedience had become something else entirely. They weren't props anymore. They were witnesses. And that frightened Reeves more than any enemy gunfire. That evening, Connors couldn't eat. He cleaned his rifle 3 times just to keep his hands busy. "What are we doing, Doc?" he asked Harris. The medic didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. The uneasy realization that victory could still feel dirty. That night, the camp's generator coughed out and the lights died. In the darkness, someone whispered near the prisoner's tent, an American voice. "You don't have to keep it on," it said. But the women didn't move. They sat upright, faces still gray under the moonlight, refusing to wash away what had become their quiet protest. By dawn, Reeves noticed the difference. The women had redrawn the ash themselves, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His order had become their rebellion, Harris wrote. He didn't understand he'd given them a flag made of dust, and they claimed it. The lieutenant's fury boiled. He slammed his fist against a tent pole, and when the photographer returned the next morning, Reeves had already decided if they wanted to make a spectacle of shame, he'd make sure the world saw it. The camera looked harmless, just another Army-issue Graflex with a smudged lens. But when the photographer, Sergeant Paul Drexler, raised it toward the women, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Reeves stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw locked. "Get the faces," he said. The women, 7 in all, stood shoulder to shoulder, their cheeks gray and cracked, ash outlining their eyes like bruises. The first click sliced through the silence. Snap. The second click followed. Then nothing. Harris described it later. The click of that camera felt louder than artillery. The scene didn't look like victory. It looked like confession. Even Drexler hesitated after the third shot, lowering the camera slowly. "Sir," he muttered, "this ain't for the papers." Reeves glared. "You let me worry about that." The photographer obeyed, but his hands shook as he packed up. He'd seen death, but not this humiliation frozen on film. Later, he'd jot a small note on the photo envelope, Okinawa, non-combatant pose. Disturbing. That one word disturbing would keep the image buried for decades. Around the camp, soldiers avoided the women's eyes. Connors turned away each time he passed them, guilt gnawing at him like rust. The women, however, didn't look broken. Something subtle had shifted. They no longer stood like prisoners, but like mourners guarding a truth only they could understand. Their stillness was defiance. Their silence, resistance. That night, Harris couldn't sleep. He opened his diary and wrote, "One flash, and the war felt smaller. One photograph, and we all became part of it." He wondered what history would make of such an image if anyone would ever see it at all. The ash on those faces wasn't just soot now. It was testimony at dawn. Drexler developed the negatives in a small field tent, the faint smell of chemicals mixing with salt air. As the picture appeared on paper gray women against a ruined backdrop, he froze. "Jesus," he whispered, "what have we done?" He sealed the prints in a brown envelope, marked for command review. When the trucks left camp that afternoon, that envelope rode with them bound for the censor's office in Washington, D.C., where truth met red ink. Washington, D.C., late summer of The war's final battles are still burning across the Pacific. But inside a narrow army press office, silence hums under fluorescent lights. A clerk opens a brown envelope stamped for command review. Inside are 3 contact prints, 7 Japanese women, faces gray with soot, standing rigid before an American officer. The clerk pauses, frowns, and slides the photos toward his superior. Within minutes, the air shifts from bureaucratic calm to quiet unease. Colonel Robert Hensley, chief censor for Pacific Imagery, adjusts his glasses and studies the top print. "Unfit for release," he murmurs, almost instinctively. His pen glides across the approval sheet, leaving a thick red stroke that bleeds through the paper. "Morale hazard," he adds. That's how shame gets sanitized by paperwork. Out of every 100 Pacific War photos, nearly 28 were censored for moral sensitivity, but this one felt different. It didn't show gore or propaganda. It showed victory's ugly reflection. Across the hall, a typist whispers to another, "They look like US just tired." The comment earns a glare, but she's right. The image doesn't glorify, it questions. For the first time, the American viewer might have seen not triumph, but tragedy shared by both sides. The photo never makes it past the censorship office. It's stamped, sealed, and buried in the classified archive where history goes to suffocate quietly. Meanwhile, back on Okinawa, the story spreads like smoke through prisoner gossip. Ash on the face, or punishment. The rumor mutates, but the tone changes. It's no longer fear, it's defiance, wrapped in whispers. The women begin to reapply the suit daily, turning humiliation into unity. Guards notice, but no one intervenes. The ash becomes their flag. Harris, hearing this, writes in his diary, "They hid the photo, but not the act. You can't censor memory." He wonders if the women even know their image crossed an ocean only to be buried under red ink. Maybe that's mercy. Or maybe it's one last insult in Washington. The photograph sits locked in a file cabinet labeled Okinawa, Discipline Irregularities. And while the official record grows cleaner, the truth festers in the shadows waiting for its next witness. Because on that island, the women have decided something the army never expected. They'll keep the ash. By choice. By the 10th day, the order had stopped mattering, but the ash remained. Every dawn, as gray light spilled across the camp, the 7 women gathered near a dented water drum. Instead of washing, they dipped their fingers into the cold soot along the barrel's rim and traced dark streaks across their cheeks. What began as humiliation had transformed into ceremony. The guards didn't understand it. They just watched. The women moved in silence, their motions deliberate. like monks performing a prayer with no words. Harris recorded the scene with trembling clarity. They do it now without orders. Each mark is defiance, disguised as duty. He couldn't tell if the lieutenant noticed, or simply refused to. The ritual had turned the camp upside down, authority twisted into mockery, obedience into power. Reeves's command was being rewritten in front of his eyes, and the women were its authors. In the mess tent, soldiers whispered, "They're doing it again." A few laughed awkwardly, but most didn't. Connors muttered, "It's like they're daring us to see them." And he was right. The ash had become a mirror reflecting back everything the Americans didn't want to face. Shame, pride, guilt. They all looked the same color in soot. By noon, sweat streaked their faces, blending gray with salt, yet they didn't wipe it away. Some of the men began leaving small things near their corner of the camp: bandages, water, bread. No one admitted it, but respect was spreading quietly through compassion's cracks. In one report, later declassified, a witness described the scene. The women appeared calm, even proud. They maintained composure, not out of fear, but something else: control. That night, Harris passed by the enclosure as the women remarked their faces by lantern light. The flame flickered across gray skin, eyes steady and unbroken. He felt a strange reverence, the kind reserved for sacred spaces. "We made them wear death," he wrote, "and they made it look like life." In the dark, beyond the wire, surf crashed against coral reefs, indifferent and eternal. The ritual would continue for 9 days, each one turning silence into strength. And when the 10th dawn came, the guards saw something they never expected: a figure in a clean American uniform stepping forward to join them. She was one of their own. The next morning began, like all the others until Lieutenant Grace Nolan stepped into the yard. She was 28, a U.S. Army nurse from Illinois, stationed at the Okinawa Field Hospital, barely half a mile away. Word about the ash-faced prisoners had reached her the night before, whispered by a supply sergeant. At dawn, she walked across the muddy yard, white uniform gleaming against the gray camp. Every soldier stopped talking. Even Reeves froze when he saw her. Nolan didn't salute. She didn't ask permission. She simply bent down beside the barrel, pressed her fingers into the soot, and dragged a dark streak across her own cheek. Gasps rippled through the line of prisoners and guards alike. She straightened up, meeting their eyes. No speeches, no orders, just quiet solidarity. Harris would later write, "She didn't speak their language, but they understood every word." For a long suspended moment, the entire camp stood still. Then one of the Japanese nurses, Fumiko, stepped forward, bowing slightly before returning the gesture, smearing fresh ash down her own face. The ritual spread through the line again, but this time the movement felt different. It wasn't rebellion, it was connection. Reeves's face turned crimson. "Lieutenant Nolan," he barked, "wipe that off now." She looked at him calmly and replied, "Then maybe you should too." The silence that followed was heavier than artillery. Reeves couldn't find words. The other soldiers pretended to be busy, shoveling dirt, checking rifles, anything but meet his gaze. Later, Harris found Nolan sitting by the fence, her face still marked. "You'll realize he's going to come after you for that," he warned. She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but somebody had to stop pretending we're better just because we won." Harris didn't answer. He just wrote her name in his diary, underlined twice. That night, the guards whispered about what they'd seen. Some called it foolish, others called it brave, but none could deny the effect it cracked the wall between captor and captive. Even the women's posture changed, shoulders lifting slightly, eyes no longer downcast. When Reeves finally confronted Nolan the next morning, his voice shook not with command, but with confusion. And in that trembling confrontation, the last illusion of order in Camp 19 began to crumble. By sunrise, the camp felt like a storm waiting to break. Lieutenant Reeves marched toward the infirmary tent, boots kicking up dust. The men nearby straightened instinctively. No one wanted to be caught in his path. Inside, Grace Nolan was cleaning bandages, ash still faint on her cheek. Reeves stopped in the doorway, eyes blazing. "Lieutenant Nolan," he hissed, "you're undermining discipline." She didn't look up. "Then maybe discipline needs undermining," she replied softly. The words hit harder than a bullet. For a moment, Reeves stood frozen. He'd faced enemy fire, but not defiance from one of his own. "You think this is a charity ward?" he snapped. "They're prisoners, not patients." Nolan finally looked him in the eye. "They were nurses, just like me. You think ash makes them less human?" The tent fell silent, except for the low hum of the generator outside. Harris, standing at the back, watched as two versions of the same uniform collided, one driven by rage, the other by empathy. The argument spilled outside, drawing a small crowd. Reeves shouted, "You're forgetting which side you're on." Nolan's voice stayed calm. "I haven't forgotten, sir. I just remember why we're supposed to be the better one." The men shifted uncomfortably. No one dared step between them. The war had blurred too many lines already. And now, they were watching one being redrawn in real time. That night, Harris recorded the scene with deliberate precision. "Saw an American fight another American for the right to see prisoners as people. Didn't think I'd live to see that." The diary line was short, but it carried the weight of an entire generation's confusion. Command learned of the confrontation the next day. Rumors spread fast in the field. Officer challenges officer over POW treatment. Headquarters didn't like stories that smelled of shame. A truck arrived from the forward post, carrying a courier with sealed orders. Reeves read them in silence, jaw tightening with every line. Harris caught a glimpse of the header. "Discipline irregularities, immediate transfer recommended." That night, Reeves packed his gear, face pale under the lamplight. For the first time since Okinawa, he looked less like a commander and more like a casualty. And by dawn, he was gonna leave behind an order that would die the moment he left. But his departure didn't end the story. It began the reckoning. The morning after Reeves's transfer, the camp woke to the sound of a truck grinding up the hill. A courier from headquarters, waving a sealed envelope marked urgent. The sergeant in charge tore it open while the guards gathered, curiosity prickling like static in the air. He read the order aloud, voice steady but cautious. "Effective immediate, cease all non-standard disciplinary actions toward enemy prisoners. Violations will result in court-martial." The words hung there for a long, stunned moment, and then relief. Quiet, cautious, collective. For the first time in weeks, the women were told they could wash, but none of them did. They just stood there, faces still faintly gray beneath the morning sun, watching the soldiers who had once watched them. The ash had sunk deeper than skin. It had become memory, armor, identity. Harris noted in his diary, they were free to wash the shame away. None wanted to. The camp's atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Guards started speaking to the prisoners with something like respect. Connors offered extra rations. Others let them linger near the fence to feel the sea wind. The tone of command softened, not from guilt, but exhaustion, the kind that comes when the war's noise finally fades into human silence. Even the American flag above the gate looked different now, its fabric heavy with salt and thyme. Nolan worked double shifts in the infirmary, tending to both Americans and Japanese alike. When asked why she kept the ash mark on her cheek even after the order ended, she said quietly, "Because it reminds me how close we came to forgetting who we were." No one argued. Even the sergeant, who had once enforced Reeves's rules, now turned a blind eye. By mid-June, a follow-up directive arrived dated the 18th of 1945, filed under discipline irregularities, Okinawa sector. It officially voided Reeves's command. Bureaucratically, the ash order never existed, but its echo lived on in diaries, in memories, and in faces that refused to fade clean. That evening, Harris wrote his final Okinawa entry. The ash stayed, even after it was forbidden. Maybe that's how truth survives stains that won't wash out. When night fell, he closed his notebook for the last time, unaware that his words would one day reopen the story decades later, in a world desperate to remember what war tries hardest to erase. July 1945. The war's final breath trembled through Okinawa's humid air. The camp's fences sagged, its sentries half asleep, the sea beyond the wire whispering a peace no one trusted yet. Harris sat on an ammo crate, pen poised above the last clean page of his diary. Around him, the world was folding itself into endings, trucks departing, tents collapsing, orders softening into rumors. He looked toward the corner where the 7 women stood. Their faces were pale now, the ash mostly washed by rain, but faint shadows lingered, gray stains, like fingerprints of history. He began to write. They walked past the fence, faces still gray, and somehow they looked free. His hand trembled as he finished the line. It wasn't triumph or regret, just truth. The women were being transported to a repatriation point, 80 prisoners in total, scheduled for release once surrender terms cleared. They boarded the trucks silently, heads high, no tears, no salutes, only that steady gaze that had haunted him since the tunnel. Nolan stood beside him, bandaged arm in a sling, watching the convoy disappear into the dust. "You think anyone will believe what happened here?" she asked. Harris smiled faintly. "Only if someone writes it down." She looked at the notebook in his lap. "Then don't stop." But he did. That line became his last. Weeks later, Japan surrendered. The news spread through radio static and cheers, but in Camp 19, it sounded hollow. Victory didn't taste like pride, tasted like exhaustion and silence. The prisoners went home, the soldiers shipped out, and the island began to heal in uneven patches of grass and memory. Decades later, when that notebook surfaced in Kansas, the final entry hit like a whisper through time. Historians debated the event, searching for records that didn't exist. Some called it myth, others misconduct. But those who read Harris's words felt something undeniable. The echo of empathy that outlasted war. The story of the ash-faced women never appeared in official histories. It lived only in a medic's fading handwriting, a nurse's quiet courage, and the photograph that the world wasn't allowed to see, because sometimes the truest record of war isn't in victory parades or medals, it's in the stains that refuse to fade, and the silence that still speaks.